Hey everybody, welcome back. This is words number 36.2.2 because Robert Forte is with us for a third time. Today we will be discussing Albert Hoffman, who is known as the father of LSD. We will be taking a break from focusing on the manifestation, or sort of the effects, right? The sort of manifestations of the politics of the current moment, and kind of rewinding to something that is not often looked at in terms of the machination behind the politics that are causing for current manifestations. So we're going to do that today, and I wanted to welcome back. Well, Dani, first of all, nice to be with you.
And thanks for having me. I just want to say I really like how you went 36.2. And you like dropped it like a game
dropping the game sign, right? There we go. Yeah. And Robert, welcome back. It's we got a really nice response to our previous two shows. People really seem to be liking this series. And I'm looking forward to digging into Albert Hoffman with you, as he is not someone that I knew too much about before yesterday, and of course I found his background very interesting. So I'm delighted to have you back and to hear what you have to say about him. How you doing, Robert?
Thank you. Really great to be here. I'm enjoying these conversations and getting to know you guys as well. So let's go for it.
All right. So why don't we just jump right in with, why don't you let us know sort of how you became acquainted to Albert Hoffman, and sort of, you know, your perceptions of him then and now, and then I'm going to let Dani run away and I'll come in later. I'm going to sit and learn from you two right now.
Okay. Let me start with this because, you know, we have been getting into some material that is, you know, kind of challenging and a little, what some people might say, dark or critical, you know, conspiracy theory that, and I want to emphasize at the beginning that I have a really profound respect for psychedelic drugs, for LSD and for psilocybin. And my long friendship and relationship with Albert Hoffman was extremely important to me since 1983 when I met him. And and we continued a correspondence. You know, there was a gap of about 10 years, but, you know, right up until the last time I saw him, it was a great honor to be invited to be a speaker at his 100th birthday party. I was a director of the Albert Hoffman Foundation in Los Angeles, a job I took on at his request to try to straighten out this endeavor. And I really love the man. He treated me like his grandson for many years, and I considered that a great privilege and a great honor. And even as I have kind of learned a lot of things about him and the history of LSD and psilocybin that challenges the official story, I just want to emphasize the appreciation for the power, the healing potentials of these substances. And even though there is a shadow side that we're going to talk about today, so I just want to emphasize that right at the beginning. And so, you know, talking about Albert Hoffman is really it's really mostly about LSD because that's the thing that he's most well known for in our society. He also was the inventor of two other very, very important drugs. One, methergine, which is commonly used in obstetrics because it stops uterine bleeding. It's also used in abortions. And he also invented or discovered a drug, hydrogine, which is not very well known in the United States, but it's one of the most commonly prescribed geriatric medicines in Europe. It's and both hydrogine and methergine, as well as LSD, come from ergot, the fungus that grows on grain. And I always thought that was very interesting, that here's ergot, this almost very tiny fungus that produces these lysergic acid amides that are so instrumental in actual biological birth. Ergot's been used for centuries by midwives in the birthing process. LSD, of course, has been discovered to have profound significance in a psychological, spiritual rebirth process, and hydrogen used at the end of life to elongate life. So, so my history with LSD really begins way back in 1966 or 67, when I was just 9 or 10 years old. And it's kind of funny, sort of, you know, when I look back on it, I had to give a report in class. It was fifth grade for, I think it was called Current Events. And I just grabbed the Life or Look magazine from the table when I'm on my way to school, because I was so dazzled by the cover. And it was an issue on LSD, bright colors, and it just kind of attracted me. And I took this to school, and I was going to give my presentation on LSD, which of course I knew absolutely nothing about as this little kid. And so I took it into class, and I asked my teacher, what is LSD? What does LSD stand for? And she had this little smile on her face, and it was the only indication that the 60s ever came to where I grew up. And she said, "Let's save democracy." And I just, of course, that went right over my little head. And but that was my first like inkling of LSD. I was fascinated by the colors and the pictures in the article. You know, I probably didn't even read it, but it was fascinating to me. So, and I want to return to this quality of fascination and the fact that this was first published in Life or Look magazine, I forget, because that's a very important part of this story that we're telling. And so, you know, a few years went by, and then LSD made it to where I was growing up in Bergen County, New Jersey, in a sort of affluent little town in the very northeastern part of New Jersey. And LSD started to come in there, and I saw what it did to kids in my class, and I thought it just freaked people out. I remember one kid in particular who was a close friend of mine got into LSD and then got involved in other drugs, and he was a super smart guy and ended up, you know, really kind of a mess and addicted to drugs. And I saw this happening, and I just said, man, I'm not ever going anywhere near that stuff. You know, that's dangerous, and it really fucks you up. And I felt that way for quite a long time, until years into college. I think I mentioned this last time we talked. It wasn't until I learned about the role of psilocybin mushrooms in ancient religions that I realized there was something significant about these altered states of consciousness, and I decided to give it another look. But my first opinion, my first sense of LSD was that it was dangerous and it messed people up. Mm-hmm. So I started to read everything I could. Within a short time, I had learned quite a bit, and decided to devote my life to, or my graduate school career to understanding psychedelic drugs. And then Albert Hoffman came to the United States. He came to give a talk at the University of California in Santa Barbara in 1983. Now, by this time, I had already begun a relationship with Stan Groff and several other people, and I had decided that I was going to organize a conference and bring everybody of any significance who had done the early work in the 50s, 60s, and 70s all together in one room, and help restore this subject into scholarly and scientific respectability. And so I flew from Chicago to Santa Barbara, really just to meet Albert Hoffman. And not only did I meet, that was the first time I met Albert Hoffman, but it was the first time I met Terence McKenna. And by this time, I'd had several very important, profound LSD experiences, and I had considered LSD to be one of the most important discoveries of the 20th century. I mean, what did I know? Still, I'm only in my very early 20s, but I was very impressed with what had happened. I had a background in yoga and meditation, and I combined those with my learning with Groff, and it was a very big deal. And so Albert was like this amazing man that I was going to be privileged to meet And I introduced myself, and we had many associates, and he welcomed me to sit down, and we had our first conversation. And then I invited him to this conference that I had put on at Esalen, and got to spend picked him up at the airport in San Francisco, and spent 10 days with him at Esalen, and tripped with him there on MDMA. And we maintained a kind of close connection from that point on. And so that's kind of the first part of my relationship with Albert. Again, as this grandfatherly, saintly, one of the most important, scientists of the 20th century, who introduced this drug, his problem child, he called it. And he saw me as a person that was going to help restore the reputation and get this drug to be used in more, proper environments. And so it wasn't until around 1988, I think it was, I was out visiting Albert. Was it 88? I made several visits to see him at his home in Switzerland. But there was one time when, oh yes, I was working for the Albert Hoffman Foundation, and Sandoz Pharmaceuticals was going to donate their LSD archives to our foundation. And I went over there to size up the job. And I was I was in a room in the basement of Sandoz with Albert and a guy named Andrei Viskov, who was the archivist of Sandoz. And I'm standing there in front of this, all these bookshelves, and I picked off a binder. And so whenever Sandoz sent LSD out to anybody beginning in the early 40s, it asked for, the lab notes and the research papers and everything. So there was this, kind of big archive. And I picked up one of these binders and I was flipping through it and all, in all their original languages. And I came to one document that was from the Israeli Psychological Association. And it was a very impressive document. It said Israeli Psychological Reports across the top like that. And then there was a big Star of David stamped right in the middle there. And then the rest of the document was written in Hebrew. And it was just striking, the different fonts. And I just showed it to Albert, who was standing right next to me. And when he saw the Star of David, he went like this. He went like it was a reflex. He went, like that. And I was taken aback. And then suddenly, like, he realized, oh, whoops, this wasn't one of my German Swiss friends. This is my friend from California. He did it sort of for the benefit of Viskov, like, they like smiled, and I was like, what is this? And then I just turned the page and acted like that moment never happened. Mm-hmm. But that moment did happen, and it had touched some other things that I was beginning to learn around that time about the CIA and the Nazis and the, kind of not as well-known history of collusion between these, and how the CIA was involved with LSD, and it was things I had kind of overlooked in my first, 10 years of studying the subject. But now I was starting to become interested in it. There was a footnote in Timothy Leary's autobiography about Albert Hoffman's close relationship with Ernst Junger, and that Junger was a Nazi, like a prominent figure in the Third Reich, whose books, Ernst Junger is a very famous German writer, caliber like Aldous Huxley. Not at this time, only a few of his books were translated into English, but he was a major literary and philosophical figure in German history, modern German history. Hitler used to use Junger's books to glorify warfare and the supremacy of the Aryan race. And then here he is, according to Leary in this footnote, a close friend of Albert Hoffman's. And then you go back and read LSD, My Problem Child, the very excellent book of Albert Hoffman's autobiography. He writes about Ernst Junger and how he idolized Ernst Junger. And so I just started to think that was really kind of interesting. And it just helped me turn a corner. So, Dani, you, I know you received that book by Alan Piper.
Yes, I read it. I read Strange Bedfellows, and I'm excited to dive into it. Before we go there, because I think another part of this series, aside from exploring, the collusion in the movement, is also the alchemy of the three of us and what brought us together. So I just feel called to acknowledge that, similarly to you, when I was 7, I stole my mother's copy of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was the first song that I became obsessed with and played over and over and over on a loop. I didn't really know why. And I went through all of high school and undergrad at UC Santa Barbara without taking any intoxicants whatsoever. And the first intoxicant that I ever took was LSD, which absolutely changed the course of my life forever. So I just wanted to kind of speak to that, and as well, the reverence I have for it. It was interesting in reading Strange Bedfellows, which was so well done and tracked all of Albert Hoffman's associations with Nazis, and there were many. And I also thought what was really striking about Ernst Junger, there were so many well-documented instances of his allegiance to Nazism and fascism and whatnot, and that he did the translation to the Learned Elders of Zion, really stuck out for me. But as I was going through it, I thought, well, I see all these associations, like he was definitely comfortable being with people who had these ideas, but it wasn't clear in that book that he had any specific Nazi ideals. So then, as a journalist, I immediately went to, well, who funded his research? And so I dug into Sandoz a little bit. And I found that Sandoz supplied LSD to the psilocybin project on mind control at Harvard University, led by George Soros and Timothy Leary.
Wait, excuse me. George Soros?
Yep.
This is news to me. George Soros was involved in the funding of the Harvard project?
Yep.
Wow.
That's what it said. According to Civilian Intelligence Network.
Huh.
Yes.
Oh,
So I thought that was interesting, and just wondering, I was interested to hear what you had to say from your own personal experience, and being reviled by the sight of the Star of David says a lot. And I had wondered, was he just sort of an unwitting brain for the Nazis and didn't really realize, but just sharing that tiny anecdote would indicate something a little bit different.
Yeah, no, we're getting into some murky territory here, right? So Sandoz is also, of course, a subsidiary, or was a subsidiary of IG Farben, right? So this is, there's a lot of material there. Now, I'm not really expert on all this stuff, and at some point we ought to bring in Alan, because it was right around this time that Alan Piper and I began to correspond about this, and he's a very highly trained historian and really knows a lot more about this than I do.
He's alive?
Yes, he's alive and well,
Right.
and yeah.
Right.
And so yes, I got to know Albert personally. We hiked in nature, we tripped together, we talked about, we had letters. I'm so sad that they were burned up in my fire. And there wasn't anything unkind about him, or Nazi-like, or I remember once we were at his house, and one of the Persian Gulf Wars had just begun, and there were planes flying over, and he was very like, he just loved nature. He hated war. He hated the American military-industrial complex, even though he had a kind of complicated relationship with Leary. He really appreciated the spirit of the so-called hippie movement, the anti-war, the pro-nature movement of the 1960s. He was like that. There wasn't anything, I never noticed anything, fascist about him, or there were some sort of authoritarian streaks in him when we kind of debated about what was the right paradigm for LSD. He remained convinced, we argued about this, that he thought it was, it should be controlled by the psychiatric profession, by the medical authorities. And we would argue about that, like, the medical authorities are really, not what you might think they are in America, but, there are other disciplines, transpersonal psychology, religious studies. I was trying to kind of steer him over to appreciate that kind of thing more. So anyway, I'm just saying that he was a beautiful, gentle, wonderful man in all of my interactions with him, until this reflexive outburst about the Star David. Now, I'm just the kind of guy that I'm, looking to forgive people. And, anti-Semitism has a very long history in Europe, and particularly in Basel, where Albert grew up. And, the way I've put it over the years, that he just inherited some of this cultural baggage, and that he never, that he just didn't quite relinquish. And, Basel is a city where, hundreds of years ago, Jews weren't allowed to be buried within the city limits. There were gates at the city limits, and Jews had to pay a higher toll to get into the city. I mean, this is just part of where he grew up. And I don't think that there was, he wasn't, anti-Semitism, that's a very complicated historical, cultural construction as well. But I didn't notice anything, vile about him. I never did. I love the guy. He loved me.
And you never asked him about that moment?
I never asked him about that moment, but I did, like 10 years after that moment, I wanted to get into it a little bit more. And so I was very struck by this. As I said, there's a very interesting footnote in Timothy Leary's Flashbacks, where he says, this is another funny story, gives you an idea how complicated it is to look through this stuff. Tim has a footnote in there that says, when Albert Hoffman discovered LSD, he gave it to Sandoz and the scientists, but he also kept it for his philosophical friends. And they had these circles, and Ernst Junger was part of it. And Leary says that Junger renounced Nazism after taking LSD with Hoffman. And so I wanted to take that footnote and expand it into an article and get Albert to talk about it. And so I asked if I could come and visit him, and I wanted to talk about this story. And he said, of course. And so I made arrangements to fly over to Europe. But unfortunately, 2 days before my arrival, he fell and he broke his hip, and he was in intensive care in the hospital, and he could only be seen by his immediate family. And so I went to Europe, but I didn't see him. I just spoke with him on the phone, and I tried to talk with him about this a little bit. And he got very, very upset when I read the footnote to him. And he was like, and I felt so bad, because here he is, he's in his 90s, I think, at this point. And he was not a Nazi. He was not a Nazi, like that. I was like, okay, never mind. We won't talk about that.
Do you buy that? From what I've read, it seems like his Nazi associations and his, at least before he had this come to Jesus moment during a trip, it seemed like Junger's allegiances to Nazism and that ideology were pretty obvious.
Yes, that's the way it seems to me. and I've talked about this with my German friends. Another person that we may want to bring into this conversation, if and when I hope we elaborate here, is a very, very fine man, a good friend of mine. Although I've only met him in person at Albert's 100th birthday, but a man named Matthias Breukers. Do you know that? Do you know that name yet? Mm-hmm. Matthias Breukers is a very, very popular in Europe journalist and scholar about psychedelic drugs and cannabis and politics. And he was a very, very close friend of Albert's. He's a man my age, maybe just a year or two older. He was one of the organizers of the Albert Hoffman 100th birthday. He wrote the first and best-selling book in Europe on 9/11. And he's had many conversations with Albert about this. And I've consulted Matthias and Dieter Hagenbach, who was another close friend of Albert Hoffman's, and Alan Piper to get more of the lowdown on Junger, because I'm not really a historian. I don't read German. There's a lot that gets lost in translations. And so, I'm gathering this information. Like some people say that Junger was further to the right than even Hitler, that Hitler was like a popularist, and that the real Third Reich intelligentsia was alarmed that they had this view of the 1,000-year Reich. They had a certain patience about this global domination agenda, and Hitler wanted it all in his lifetime, and that there were assassination attempts on Hitler, not because they disagreed with his overall vision, it's just that they thought he was moving too fast. And that Junger was one of those more like, another kind of Nazi. So yes, that's something that we need to look at. And I'm, again, not really an expert on it, but when we get into this further, we'll bring Matthias and Alan. Dieter, unfortunately, is dead. But, a lot of Germans they're still very touchy about this stuff. And so...
I did think that Piper did a good job at sort of seeding the landscape to understand how the counterculture was sort of an offshoot of what started in Germany and what came out of the Nazi movement. Like that kind of made sense. And I especially liked the concept of the cultic milieu and how it sort of makes it easier for people to like slip in with nefarious intentions who aren't really aligned with the ideas and sort of poison the realm with their own sort of counter ideas. I thought that was smart. But what I'm curious to know your take on was, it seemed to me after reading it, and I rarely think that association is indicative of collusion, but I think Piper did a good job, and there was enough of it that was very eyebrow raising. And my sense was that Hoffman was a pawn and was being used, but wasn't necessarily himself allied with these ideas, though this was the conclusion I came to before hearing your anecdote about the papers that you found.
I think that's good. That's close to the way I feel about it too. Albert was, he worked with Sandoz. He was hired as a research chemist, but he didn't come, unlike his wife, who was German-Swiss aristocracy. Albert was a very simple man and did not come from money, and just a gifted scientist. And so I think that sense is right. As I said before, he just exuded kindness and compassion and a kind of holiness. And it's very easy to understand that he could have been exploited, just caught up in the cultural milieu and kind of confused by it. And but loyal to science, loyal to culture, and but I also kind of always got the sense that he was surprised and almost a little embarrassed by his incredible fame and what had happened to him in this LSD. So that's.
I'm also, I'm just curious, because he discovered it by accident. It wasn't like he was a seeker of the outermost realms from the get-go. Did he turn into that? Was he ultimately, a psychonaut?
Well, now we get into another thing here. This is important because so there's an official story of how LSD was discovered, right? First, Albert had already become expert in ergot. He had already discovered methergine, and then the story, this kind of like Wasson, it's a kind of romantic, wonderful story that he wakes up. He discovers a technique. He's able to isolate the different alkaloids in ergot, and then he comes to this lysergic acid amide, or LSD, the 25th of a series of alkaloids he was able to find, and he notices this LSD molecule, and it's very beautiful to him. He's a chemist, he just sees a symmetry in the molecular structure, and it was very beautiful. This is 1938, and they thought maybe it would have some effect on the brain or some effect on blood flow, and they gave it to some laboratory animals, and they didn't notice anything too remarkable, and so they just put it on the shelf. And then 5 years later, on April 16th, the story goes, he woke up in the morning with, he calls it a peculiar presentiment that there's something in this molecule that I want to look at again. And he goes to his boss at Sandoz and he says, I want to do another research on this LSD. And he gets into a little debate with his boss, says no. It was 1943. It's in the middle of World War II. They're rationing gasoline. They don't have time or money for Albert's frivolous things. But because he'd already invented methergine and made so much money for the company, they gave him permission to mix up another batch of this LSD. And he accidentally somehow got a little bit into his blood on Friday, April 16th, and had the first LSD experience. It was a mild sort of thing, and he was like, wow, what is this? And then he went home and he thought about it all weekend, and then he goes back to work on Monday, April 19th, and decides to conduct an experiment. Still doesn't know if that strange experience he had on Friday was because of the material he was working with. He mixes up another batch of it, and he says, being a cautious man, I decided I would start with 250 micrograms and then gradually increase the amount until I see if I could have that experience. 250 micrograms, no substance ever known has any effects at that amount. Little did he know he was actually taking a very strong dose of something. And so then he has this first full-blown LSD trip and, rides his bicycle home, and it's a fantastic story. Okay, so that's the story that we've all been told, and that's the story that we all believed until Alan Piper, it's the story I believed until Alan Piper points out to me a very obscure German novella that was published 10 or 20 years before the discovery of LSD. And this is a book by a guy named Leo Perutz, Perutz, a not very well-known German writer. He might also have been a doctor. And he writes a novel called St. Peter's Snow. And this is a novel about a group of German occultists who have been studying ergot to try to understand if ergot could have been the activating potion of the Eleusinian mysteries. They find in ergot a magical molecule, and they release it into the public in order to start a sort of quasi-religious revival, which is actually a distraction to the political developments of Germany in the late 20s, I think it is. So here's something, these are the exact same beats of the LSD legend a decade or so before it. So Alan brought this to my attention, and this is another one of his books that I urge everyone to read that's interested in this conversation. Alan wrote a piece called The Mystery of St. Peter's Snow. Like, is it just a coincidence that they, the Mystery of St. Peter's Snow is published, and then when the Nazis come to power, it's banned and confiscated. So it disappears from literary history.
All right, I had to let the laugh in there, guys. That was
just a coincidence. It's just a coincidence.
Right? It's suspiciously similar to the Gordon Wasson, how we discovered mushrooms were a hallucinogenic kind of thing.
Kind of like that.
Yeah, right. And they always have these sort of fictional fairy tale sort of like story, like aspects to them. This is ticking boxes for me on many, many, many levels right now that I could get into. But carry on. I carry on.
Yeah. So so anyway, I wanted to point that out because I wonder. That's one of the reasons that I have come to question the official story of the discovery of LSD. The other reason has to do with the fact that, and other chemists have said this, that know more about chemistry than me, that, you know, Albert's laboratory procedures were impeccable. And for him to accidentally have absorbed LSD into his fingertips on the Friday, April 16th, was a little bit hard to swallow. And so we're questioning. We question this. And then when you throw
Did you
in
ever
this,
challenge him on the story?
no, I never did, because well, I didn't learn about the mystery of St. Peter's Snow until after he died. So Albert dies in I think he dies in 2008. But let me just say, I don't want to jump around too much, but my last meeting with him, okay, so I'm invited to give a talk at his birthday conference in 2006. It's a very big deal. It's a huge, wonderful conference in Basel, Switzerland. And I went and gave a talk on Timothy Leary. And there's a private party. There's like, you know, thousands of people there, but there's a private party for his closer friends and the presenters. And I hadn't seen Albert for quite a few years, like 6 or 7 years or so. And he sees me in the party, and he was always very excited to see me, and he takes me over to a little corner and we sit down. Oh, Robert, my old friend, what have you been doing? I have not heard from you. This is a 100-year-old guy, right? He's still like fit as a fiddle. His mind is sharp. And it was actually during those years that I hadn't seen him. Like in around 2003, I kind of shifted back into political psychology and political consciousness. 9/11 had happened, and I had begun a full-on inquiry into that. And so I sat down with him, and he said, "What have you been doing?" And I said, "Well, actually, I've been getting into 9/11 and the political consciousness and this concept that I call the psychology of non-perception, and trying to understand how it is that people fail to see the obvious, that this was an inside job by the Bush administration. And Albert and I are sitting in the corner of this room. I said it was an inside job by the Bush administration. And he grabs my forearm and he pulls me closer to him, and he says, "It was a Jewish conspiracy." Now, I'm just like getting into my 9/11 stuff. And when he said that, he said it with the same sort of way that he made that sound. And I just took it as another, anti-Semitic outburst from my old friend. And it kind of hit me in the heart. And I was like, because I didn't know. I hadn't yet gotten into the Zionist part of 9/11 yet. I was like focusing on the Bush administration and the CIA, just the way he said this. And it's just like, but it actually caused me, I was starting to wonder, like, because I had already understood like this lineage from the Third Reich into the United States through the CIA into the Bush administration. I mean, there's a direct connection. Prescott Bush, was a banker for the Reich and was busted for trading with the enemy and, all that stuff. I knew about that. But then when you start to study 9/11 and you realize that a lot of these guys who were in positions in the Bush administration in 2001 are these Zionist Jews, Elliot Abrams and Dov Zakim, and it's a little confusing to me still. I'm a beginner here, and like I'm thinking Nazis, but there's Jews, and gosh, I thought Nazis didn't like Jews, but here they are. They're like in the same room, like scheming on the same. I don't quite get this, and so I began to study more of this and began to realize there's just more to the story that there is a really an alliance between the Zionist movement and the Third Reich, and then it just gets into some nasty territory that nobody wants to really hear.
So do you think he was referencing the sort of Zionist Mossad thing, or do you think he was deferring to like a less thought out, the Jews are to blame for everything?
Well, again, I don't want to divulge too much about private correspondences, but as I said, Albert was very close friends with Matthias Breukers, whose book gets into this. So I think that Albert may have been confused about it. I don't know, maybe a little bit of both, but he certainly was aware of it, the Mossad and aspects, and just how. But then also you got to look at this because a guy that's I've been associated with for a long time, Rick Doblin, who is admits publicly his affiliation with Mossad and is one of the leading psychedelic activists, profiteers, I like to say, government agent, mind control people. And he and Albert also had a kind of close, connection. And whether that was Doblin just using him the way he uses people, or whether there was some sort of, genuine rapport, I don't know. But, like if I had only a time machine, because there was an evening when Rick Doblin and I and Albert Hoffman all took MDMA together. But again, I didn't know anything about this stuff. That was in 1984. So we got to go back in time and take MDMA and really look at all this stuff. And, I've tried to bring Albert back in dreams and see if I could contact his spirit and get a sense of like, come on, man, would you just tell me what the fuck is really going on here?
All right. So Dani, I know that like you and I sort of chatted a little bit yesterday, right? And one of the things you had said to me, and I just maybe wanted you to like give your thoughts on this aspect or complete your thoughts or whatever on it, is that having read this Strange Bedfellows book left you really confused about the political paradigm in fascism, right? So I wanted you to say something about that, because I think that's it actually goes to what he was just sort of talking about in terms of where we think things stem from, but also I think that it was a good insight on yours. I mean, a good noticing that like, I don't actually understand, right? So can you kind of talk a little bit about that? And then I'm gonna come in with some stuff.
Yeah, so the way the book was framed was through this left-right paradigm and how most people associate the psychedelic movement with the left and people who are for equality and progressive ideals. But then it was pointing to a lot of Hoffman's and Junger's associations with what they were calling the conservative right, and translating it to 2021 and how our alleged right and left are presenting themselves, like I really couldn't keep track. That framework wasn't working for me, because when I think of, you know, equality and progressive ideals, like that's not how I'm seeing the current left. It just all seemed like very confusing. And I had actually preferred if he had just written the book without those delineations, because they've become so flip-flopped and inverted that it really, that paradigm doesn't create any clarity for me personally.
Yeah, I want to just touch on that too, because I raised that point a lot. You know, this left, right, it just doesn't make sense. And I believe it was, I mean, especially now, you know, people think of, you know, Trump or, you know, George Bush, these guys, this is the right wing, and then Obama and these guys are the left wing. Well, that's, you know, to me, that's bullshit. And I think when I think of when I was first learning about political language and stuff, you know, what was left and what was right, I always thought of it having to do with the locus of power, the locus of authority, and that right wing is central authority in the state, and left wing is democracy and power to the people. Now, we don't have a left wing and right wing anymore in the United States. You know, it's all right wing. It's all like Obama, you know, like all those guys. Trump, you know, Trump then is actually more like, let's restore the power to, you know, American businesses and take it out of, you know, central authority or global domination. And so, you know, before you can really get into this and understand it, we got to really go back to the beginning and define our terms. What do we mean? I mean, they're all fascists. Fascism, to me, is like when private interests control public good. It's not like, and we're like a purely fascist country for the last 60 years here in the United States. And so, anyway,
straight up. And I mean, just the past couple weeks of what we've seen of these corporations taking such a hard line on canceling people and refusing to do business with people, you know, who opposed the veracity of the election and whatnot. And that's all allegedly from the left and to support the left. And you're right, it is all fascism at this point. And I appreciate you just naming that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, again, that's a challenge for those of us who want to articulate these ideas, because there's a large audience out there that doesn't get it. You know, I was telling Emily before you joined us, I was looking at Facebook this morning, and I've got friends who are saying, you know, oh, this is a great day for democracy. You know, we finally have a, you know, we finally have a president who, you know, who values life. I'm saying, president who values life, you know, this is a guy that's voted for every single fucking war he could imagine. And even wars, you know, he had to make up, like a war on cannabis. This is a guy, Joe Biden is, of all the newly elected presidents, he has the more blood on his hands already than anybody else, just by his 50 years voting record. And that people are like, yay, democracy. Like, you know, my God. That's what we're up against. Well, then there's permaculture, but that's yeah.
All right, so you guys did a really good job with all of that, and like I almost don't even know sort of where to start. Like there's so many places I could go with this, but the first
Can
thing.
I help?
Sure.
Because when I heard Robert mention this novel that was published 10 years before, I could just hear your brain just like jumping up and down. So that might be a decent entry point.
Okay, so I'm definitely going to hit on that. I'll go there quickly, but I just want to kind of remark on something that was just sort of said here as we go into this, right? So I think that this is, the idea that this is a left-right issue is for the people, right? Politics is for the people. It's like a horizontal struggle for power between the right and the left. The people who are, you know, powerful or in control, they see things as vertical, right? So they leave everybody fighting on this axis over here. They're concerned with this. They push people down, they let them fight this way. They're concerned with their like vertical sort of power, right? And so politics, I'm really beginning to think is actually an intelligence tactic. It gives people enough stuff to be concerned with right? While the people who have obtained the vertical power actually are concerned with something else. They pretend they're concerned with this, right? But they're concerned with something else. So it's kind of like when your mom wants to get something done, like she needs to clean the kitchen or cook dinner and you have your friends over, she will put you in the living room with a variety of toys and television shows and things to keep you guys busy so she can go in the other room and do work, right? And some of these people that we see as political figures are really just the managers of the playroom here. Meanwhile, the other people who are up much higher are concerned with something else that actually has nothing to do with politics, right? The politics is something different. And so, like, I think we have to, like, basically there's two things, right? There's control freaks and then there's people who like freedom, right? And I think fascism is just the control freaks. They want to control everything, right? And it has really nothing to do with right, left, other than the way it's been associated in its presentation. So, okay. So so I'm going to stop with that part right there real fast and go to like, so I'm going to, just so I don't forget, I'm going to hit what you said. A couple of things. So first of all, his story about how he discovered this stuff with the LSD is almost template exactly the same as the story of Gordon Wasson. And the robotic way that they repeat this story over and over, and that the story is repeated by people who are their acolytes, their fans, their followers, or whatever, right? It's almost a script, the same script that you hear Joe Rogan explain to all of his guests who pretend they've never heard of DMT before, how the DMT trip works and how his first experience was, right? Like literally, it is a script that is embedded in the minds of people who are into this stuff, right? And this sounds remarkably like that. And it's also a script because it comes from a story, right? Like it comes from this sort of, this book about the snow. And one of the things that the control freaks know, that the people who believe in freedom either are not made aware of or are like sort of influenced to not pay attention to, is that there's no difference between fiction and reality. That is a false barrier, right? Like that literally is that's for the people who are involved in the horizontal the right left struggle, not for the people who are doing this thing, right? All information for them can be equal, right? It doesn't matter where it comes from or whatever, there's no barrier. It's just they take pieces from everything to sort of develop their stuff. And we are told that you have to separate fantasy from reality, right? But the things that they present to us as reality all come from fantasy, right? And so, so I know that was kind of my thing with that little story, right? Was that like, this is like, I'm starting to recognize that all the answers to the truths I'm looking for are not going to be found in documentaries or encyclopedias or historical texts on a certain level, that are all going to be found in the make-believe, right? Because that's where either they're hidden or where the people who create reality got their ideas from anyway, right? Now, I think that like this different, the only way in which the control freaks are concerned with the same stuff that the right and left are is in this idea of like stylistic preference, or how fastidious they are about like the way something is, right? And so when you said that Stan Groff went, like I immediately,
not Stan Groff.
Stan Groff, Albert Hoffman, my apologies. Albert Hoffman went, I thought of it the same way as like somebody who really, there's a couple things that popped to my head, right? Like somebody who likes techno music as opposed to house, they can recognize that somebody might be a good DJ, but right, or whatever. Yeah. Or somebody who, right, like, so there's certain cultures that are like, okay, so one of the reasons I think that there was a level of respect, even though they were always at war with each other, between German culture and Japanese culture, because they're both very neat and tidy and fastidious, right? Like it's very like everything very precise and whatnot. Jewish culture is a little bit different than that, It isn't about like this little, like tiny, precise things with all these angles and whatever. It's more demonstrative and feeling and all. It's like the difference between if you prefer Thai or Vietnamese food, it's more of like refined flavors. If you like Chinese food, it's kind of more like spicy and salty and all over the place, right? Like, so I think what he was talking about was like, for him, is kind of that, right? Now, it was that kind of thing, is more than it was that like he was some deeply racist person or deeply anti-Semitic person. Like, he's a scientist and he has a particular way he likes doing things. He likes like a sort of neat and tidy cuisine as opposed to like a sloppy, saucy cuisine, right? Like, that's just, I took that as almost like a personal style or affect that also goes along with his culture. Now, I didn't know hardly anything about Albert Hoffman. Obviously, I've heard of him a lot, but the first thing that I noticed upon looking at him, so first of all, I'm going to share, because I'm always going to make this a part of our presentation because I think it's interesting. I am going to share what the web brain diagram of Albert Hoffman looks like. So I'm going to go here, screen share. It is a lot less populated than Gordon Wasson's was, right? But this is what it looks like, right? So there is somebody. There's a couple of things in here that I find interesting, right? So there is the 9/11 connections here. There is the connection with James Fadiman, who is a figure very popular in this microdosing movement that is going on. Who's pretty.
Okay, wait. We have to see. I know a lot about this. Like Jim Fadiman and Albert Hoffman never knew each other. There's no connection there, really.
Okay, but I mean, the connection doesn't necessarily mean that they knew each. Now, this does say that he was that they were friends, right?
They weren't. They never knew each other.
Well, hold up, Emily, because the red at the bottom right says Gordon Wasson, and it says that Albert Hoffman is the yellow, and Fadiman's in red.
Okay, so.
Yeah, this is Jan's stuff. You know, you got to go. Some of these connections are valid, but
okay. So I'm just showing. Like I said, this is about correlation, not causation, right? Okay. But it is, right. So it's a lot less busy than the Wasson thing was, but a lot of the things that you mentioned here are connected. The Eleusinian mysteries. Right, the 9/11 issues, like, so that was my point, kind of in showing this, the connection, some of the books that we've talked about, right? So that was my Ernst Younger is there, so that was my point in doing that. So I just wanted to show that. So I used this to find some articles, and then what I went to immediately, the first thing I went to is the Wikipedia page, which we know the problems with Wikipedia, but there are some things you can understand from Wikipedia, and I was surprised to find that he was Swiss. Right? Because I don't know a lot about him. It's not surprising now that I know more about him. But at the time, I guess I thought maybe he was German, right? Because you had said, he had all these connections with fascists and Nazis and whatever. So I looked at it. He's Swiss. And then I started to think he's from Basel. And another person who I pay a lot of attention to who's from Basel is Roger Federer, tennis player. Do you know who Roger Federer is, Robert?
Just that he's a tennis player, yeah.
All right, so he's a tennis player and he's from Switzerland. And he is like very, very connected with Bill Gates, right? Like, right. So Bill Gates is fascinated with Roger Federer, and Roger Federer has a lot of like foundations and does a lot of work with Bill Gates and stuff like this. And I don't think that this is because Roger Federer is some rabid evil man or some fascist or whatever. I think that the fascination is Bill Gates has it with Roger Federer. And I think some of these people that Albert Hoffman were associated were really, really quite fascinated with them. And then they were obsessed with him or fascinated with him, and they became his circle of people that he was around. So the way that they behave and the things that they talked about and their beliefs became sort of a natural part of reality for him because that was the social circle. Meanwhile, they were super interested in him. Okay, so one of the things I'm going to introduce as being like a connective tie between fascism and psychedelics is time travel and the obsession of the awareness of other worlds, right? If you really look into a lot of the things that like Nazis, supposedly technologies that they were working on, things that they were fascinated with, things that they researched, people that they had on the dole to conduct certain kinds of research, doesn't really make sense, like politically or like as a political thing. It really makes more sense in terms of like they were obsessed with, ways of creating energy, ways of crossing barriers into other realities, and time travel. And Switzerland, right? Like, so Switzerland is where the Large Hadron Collider known as CERN is, right? And this is something that is, looking for the God particle, but what it's doing is basically possibly tearing holes in the fabric of space and time, or creating sort of time kind of anomalies. Now, there's a whole discussion being had behind the scenes in alternative media as to whether these particle colliders are something that men have built or something that has always been part of the earth and have been discovered, and people are trying to control them. And a lot of these battles are over access and use of these kinds of machines or understanding them. But I see Switzerland as being hugely important to time. Right now, I don't know if it's because of its relationship with this particle collider that may be sort of part of creating what we understand as time and these kinds of realities and whatnot. But if you look at the rise of the kind of tyranny that we're talking about, it always seems to come along at a time when this idea of going to other worlds or time travel or whatever is rising. That the rise in tyranny comes with the rise in awareness of the fact that this isn't all there is, and that there may be possibilities to move between realities, move back and forth in time. And I think a lot of this stuff that is presented to the people as like political strife and battle for control over land and territory and this and that is really about battling access to other realms and who's going to control the technologies that can do that. Okay. And so psychedelics. So if you look at, so I don't know if that so Roger Federer, the style that he plays tennis and the way he is as a person, like I'm going to guess that personality wise, he's very similar to Albert Hoffman. It would be interesting to check out their astrology and to check out some other things. They're both from Basel, right? And they both have this sort of well-liked amongst the community of their peers and things like that, right? And when I was speaking earlier about like the style, right? Like there are people that they love Roger Federer no matter what. It's like more than 20 years later, and they still want Roger Federer to win every match and whatnot. And some of the other players that play a different style, they don't like that. Like they want this very refined, elegant, very almost balletic presentation of tennis. And it almost seems like that is the same kind of style that Albert Hoffman had in doing what he did. Now, both of these people, in my assessment, have an unusual relationship with time and otherworldliness, right? Like it's part of Roger Federer's playing style, but Albert Hoffman talks about whether this story about him as a boy, then he used to go off into nature and go into other worlds is true or not. Maybe it's true, maybe that's the part that's true. Like he may have been easily identified by something as a person who had the ability to move between worlds or to recognize when he was in a different space, when he was in someplace different temporally or in terms of like levels and realms of dimensions, right? And so I've noticed that systems, political figures like fascists or whatever tend to become fixated on these kind of people because they want to control that. We talked about this last time, but the movie Man in the High Castle, the TV show Man in the High Castle is really helpful to understanding this. And one of I'm not going to go too far into this because I still have more work I'm doing on it, but there was basically this machine that the Nazis were building in the show called Die Nebenwelt, right? Which is basically access to a new world, to the other world, right? And it has all of the symbolism that was around that in the show is very similar to the symbolisms that are around both LSD and time travel and things like this sort of psychedelic looking, the same thing that attracted you to the magazine cover and right, that maybe attracted the visual appeal of it is all around that. Fascism, from what I understand, is really like this desire to go into and dominate other spaces, right? And to control them more than it is that they care about like what the people like transgenderism or don't like transgenderism or if they want immigrants or not immigrants or whatever it is, right? I mean, in this Man in the High Castle, they were obsessed with finding a way to the new world and going in there and overtaking it and accomplishing the tasks that they had failed to accomplish in this world, right? It was always about, and then they'll find another world after that and they'll go in there and they'll take its resources and they'll dominate that and they'll control things there. It's this constant obsession with dominating the space.
Yeah, that's very interesting what you're saying. Of course, it's making me think about the other, the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yep.
And that whole series of films of, the Nazis' pursuit of occult power to advance their agenda. And I don't know if I want to get into this whole thing about Raiders of the Lost Ark. I kind of do, because it's very personally significant to me that, I mean, here's a movie where, the Nazis are in pursuit of the Ark of the Covenant, and then they finally find it, but they're destroyed by it, right? And it's just a weird thing in my life, particularly because when that movie came out, I just loved the movie, and especially I just loved the actress Karen Allen, who plays in that movie. And then a couple years after the movie came out, I had an LSD trip. That last scene in the movie, where one of the last scenes where the Indiana Jones and Marion Ravenwood, Karen Allen are tied to the post, and the Nazis they finally got the Ark, and they open up the Ark, and this force of God comes out of it and then destroys all the Nazis, and Indiana and Karen they don't look at it and they're safe. And that's what saves them. Well, I had an LSD trip once where something like that happened. This force got released and this like electrical energy was like crackling all around my apartment. And I just had a thing and it was like scared the shit out of me. And I just prayed and prayed. And then this white light came and saved me. And it was really beautiful. And so for a couple years, I would refer to that scene in the movie to try to tell what it was like with this crackling energy whipping all around. And it's so weird. So then years go by, it's September 11th, 2001. Well, about 2 weeks before 9/11, I'm in New York City. I'm talking with some people in the movie industry. They want to make a movie about one of my books, and they set me up on it. They said, you want to go on a blind date and meet one of our friends if we think that you guys would hit it off. I say, okay, sure. Well, they set me up on a blind date with Karen Allen, the actress in that movie.
Yeah, which goes to my comment about no barrier between fiction and reality.
And so I'm just amazed, and we hit it off, and we start hanging out, and then we become romantic partners. She becomes my girlfriend. It was actually the night of September 10th when she invites me to spend the night with her for the first time, and I wake up in New York City with her in my arms, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm in heaven, like what's going on here? And then 9/11, just 3 miles away, and the towers explode, and we're like in her bedroom together when this happens, and she's still one of my dearest friends. But I've often really just wondered, like, what the fuck, all these levels of time and
So
crazy shit.
To all of my and our regular listeners, Robert has just demonstrated exactly kind of where I'm going with all of my material, that there are these things that are part of the real world and part of the quote unquote fictional world that we as individuals somehow become entangled with and act to sort of create our reality around us, right? And it's not that myself or Robert or whatever are particularly special. I think this happens to most people on a certain level.
Yeah.
But it's the way you start to use that to formulate your story about yourself and your position, like how reality organizes itself around you, right? So now what you were just talking about like these technologies, right, that like destroy all the Nazis and stuff like that. I think our genetics are really important in connection to some of these things that people think of as like ancient technologies, right? And I think that like one of the issues between the Germans and the Jews, it isn't what people think it is, in my opinion, is that, like the Nazis are very scientific. They like to build things. They like to create things. They like to figure out how to make it work themselves and whatnot. And it's possible that like maybe the more, I don't even know how to say it right? But like the more Jewish way of doing things is more like about a natural resonance with something as opposed to like, creating your own version yourself. So it's kind of like, the whole thing, I mean, I was taken aback with all of this stuff as I was reading about Albert Hoffman and how he, would isolate and synthesize and stuff like that. Like he'd take things that were natural and then he'd isolate them and then he'd try to, find ways to synthesize them artificially. He was doing all this stuff kind of like the same way. It's like playing God with the GMO shit, right? Like that kind of stuff, right? Yeah, and I think that like maybe traditionally, or at least historically, and this may have been part of the Nazi obsession with examining the bodies of Jews and the eyes and the central heterochromia and stuff like that, was to find out how something about their genetics was naturally in resonance with some of these ancient technologies, to the point that like they seemed to activate when they came around them or something like that, and then tried to sort of mimic that in some of their creations. The German people are incredibly industrious, right? They build wonderful cars, they come up with lots of technologies and stuff like that, but it's a different style of making magic than is associated with like Jewishness, Kabbalah. I don't even know if I'm saying this right because it's not my area. Do you know what I'm saying, Dani?
I do, and I want to speak to it because I think it's like you were saying before in drawing the connection between Japanese culture and German culture, very orderly, very hierarchical, right? Yeah. You're talking about that top down. Judaism, the Torah is unfinished.
Mhm.
You look at Passover, we're all asking questions and figuring it out, and there's no real answer. We're all just sort of tapping into our own knowingness.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the primary differentiations. And also, Robert, when you were talking about the scene in is it Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they open the Ark and all these people turn into skeletons, which is also etched into my mind. I'm thinking of mainstream media, and right now everyone who watches it in real time kind of turning into these zombies. And I'll very often have the inclination, I haven't had a television, for more than 20 years, but there are moments, especially this year, where I've thought, the president's going to make an address, I should tap in and listen. And literally every time I get this hint, don't put your attention on that in real time. It's a trap. There's something toxic and nefarious coming through. And just noticing people's state of mind, and people who are tracking mainstream media, very angry, very divisive, very riled up. Those of us who don't, as we were talking about before the show started, having a great time. 2020 was a great year for us. Not really as affected. And I'm certainly not saying that mainstream media is the arc per se, but I'm just sharing kind of what came to mind.
I appreciate that. That's good.
So
I think of it as our opportunity to, as I said at the very beginning, that I have a really profound appreciation and hope that we're in this psychedelic renaissance you know, like the drugs were introduced into our society in the 50s and 60s as they were weapons. It was a psychological operation to control and distract consciousness in the way Huxley had envisioned. And there was a little backfire in there. You know, they did not expect that people would actually benefit and empower themselves through psychedelic experiences. And I think this is when we get into our Leary episode, I'll get into this more, but it backfired a little bit, that these weapons that the deep state or the Fourth Reich or whatever you want to call these oligarchs that put it out there, it backfired on them, and it empowered people politically. It through Leary's intervention, Leary turning on them, caused people to question authority and to think for themselves, and it worked. It empowered people, and their weapons backfired on them. And so now they withdrew, and now this psychedelic renaissance, this psychedelic psyop is being revved up again, even more so. And we have an opportunity to help turn it against them. That's at least that's what I'm gonna devote myself to.
So I wanted to say, I think those are good points. And I wanted to say a couple of other things about the connection between psychedelics and time travel or other worlds, right? And so I don't know that you can actually time travel or go to other worlds when you're on psychedelics, right? But I think you can see them, right? I think you can sort of observe them and maybe like penetrate them sort of virtually, right? Kind of like when you play like a virtual reality game, right? You don't actually go into the place on the screen, but for all intents and purposes, you're being dropped in the middle of it, and you can learn how to maneuver around in that space and get an understanding of it, right? And so I think that was part of the obsession with the psychedelics, and then obviously like later in the programs here with like mind control and stuff like that. But even why there was psychedelics were part of the counterculture in Germany, right? Then they moved it over here, is I think that like they were looking to have the space described for them, right? So that when they actually built the machinery to go there, they would know what to expect once they were there.
So like, are you saying trippers are foot soldiers helping them map?
Especially children, because children will describe exactly what they see, right, without a filter. Like the older we get, the more we think we understand what something is when we see it. The children will just say what it looks like or what it feels like or whatever. They won't try and compare it to something else that they already know, or they won't associate it with something that they know from their world, right? So I think the other part, so there's that. But then there's some connection between psychedelics and being able to understand the energy and the projective geometry of something. And if you look at like when Albert Hoffman was talking about the molecule was quite beautiful, right? If you look at the way when you look at molecules or atoms, they always have like the balls with the bars that connect them and they make a geometric shape. Well, then you can go look up the geometry of that substance, right? And so when you understand the geometry of something, there's multiple ways to accomplish it, right? You can take the molecule, right? And then your body is sort of in resonance with its geometry, the projective geometry of that particular chemical. You can create a sound or a vibration or whatever that cymatically creates that as well. You can draw it, right? Like when we were little, we used to like draw a circle on the ground and step into another world. If you can draw the geometry of something, then it sort of allows penetration into that space. And psychedelics help to visualize that. So they're showing this other place that may exist, right? And you can kind of go there and get familiar with it. But also it's sort of a diagram of a geometry of how to approach it. So they need to know that stuff for when they're building their technologies to sort of penetrate into that space. They need to understand that. So I think that is part of it. And then one of the things that I think happened that is part of how the vertical space, this control freaks of going into other realms, trickles down into this world, and where the connection between the politics and the lower end and up here happens, is they started to recognize that those same psychedelics could be used for other things. When you're in the psychedelic space, and I know this from reading some papers my mom wrote when she was working for Psychon, which is a subsidiary of Tavistock, I believe, and also from my own experiences and research I've done. You become part of a network, right? Like and you can observe what else is going on in the network. So it became incredibly useful for spying, right? I think, like, you know, it's kind of like a easy on-ramp to what remote viewing requires discipline and a natural talent for to be able to do. So when you have like, I think I had this experience recently in a psychedelic experience where, like, oh, I recognized that I sort of had this connection and the ability to see into the reality and the mental space of other people who have done the same thing, or, you know what I mean, who have done the same thing. It's kind of like, you know, when you work at a company and you have the intranet within your company where you know, you can go, and people from outside the company can't see what the other people are doing, but inside the company you can, right? Like that kind of stuff. And so it became incredibly effective for spying and for controlling things that, like, it wasn't why they were doing it, but while they were worried about penetrating into other worlds or time travel or whatever, they recognized this. And I think this is also part of why there's this push for legalization, right? Or you know, whatnot. It's to sort of crowdsource the issues of looking into other realities, but also to know what other people know. Right? It's a good, like, it was just legalized recreationally in Washington, D.C. Right? Can you imagine that, like, if they know that, like, everybody who runs out and does mushrooms, we're now going to be able to, like, see into their, you know, their awarenesses in a way we haven't been able to before. Right? So I think that, like, there is very much a connection between fascism, psychedelics, and time travel, or exploring other worlds, right? And I think that a lot of these things that we think of as, like, the particle accelerators or high technologies are actually technological ways of connecting with some of these other worlds, right? And that the fight on the ground level is really about controlling access to those. Some people create their own, others are trying to figure out how to use things that already exist and whatnot. And, you know, I haven't had a chance to dig into it yet, but I went, for some reason, it struck my mind to look into particle accelerators in combination with psychedelics. And there are hundreds of scholarly papers written about those topics where both topics come up in the same paper. And you would think, what the fuck would psychedelics have to do with particle accelerators, right? But there's a connection. You know, and even some of the visuals created by the technology of particle accelerators look very much like what you see on a psychedelic experience. And why is that? Yeah. Right? So I think that, to what you're talking about, and maybe this will put you at ease a little bit over your friendship with him, right? Like, I don't think that he was a horrible monster. I think he was probably a brilliant man, right, who had both a natural tendency towards otherworldliness and the intellect to understand how to bring that down to the base chemical level, like, and arrange it, and then take it back out there. Now, the obsession with LSD is it is more synthesized than, like, mushrooms are, even though he did that too. He isolated the psilocin and the psilocybin, right? Like, it's different when you synthesize it and take it down to a level where you can actually tinker with it and control it. It's different than when you just eat the mushroom out of the ground. And these were attempts to control nature and play God in the same way that we accuse Monsanto of doing, you know, right now. So he got carried away with some of his brilliance. And there were people all around him looking to exploit that. So both things about him are true, right? Like, I don't know that he was, like, a horrible anti-Semite, racist, Nazi, or whatever, right? But stylistically, those people, like, that method of doing things, the German method, was more appealing to him than the style that was deployed by others, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's a preference.
Yeah, Emily, I mean, you just said so much. You know, this is this is sort of a critique in a way of the medium, is that you really need to slow down and write this stuff out. and with references and charts, because I mean, I'm kind of dazzled with this. In last time we talked, you had a similar thing about a character that was using the mushroom, and I was like, whoa, wait a minute, slow down. I really want to take my time and look at each one of these things that you're saying and connect it back to the references. And I mean, it's so very exciting to hear it and stimulating, but you know, to really sink your teeth into it, it's another format that we need to create for you. And I'd love to be a sounding board and help get this out for people to see. It's super fascinating to me, and I thank you.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something like writing things down and charting them out and whatever is not like something that comes natural to me. So help that I could get from people, because I've heard this about a variety of topics that I talk about, that if I could just lay it out in a step-by-step fashion, right?
But if we only knew a writer, like, can you think of any writers? You know, we might know that.
Can we think of any writers who don't have a big stack of projects waiting for their genius? I feel like for you, it's just like one mind-blowing idea, and then another, and then another, and then another, and it's like, whoa, like trying to keep up and have the stamina because there's so much there. And before we get too far away, when we're talking about the time travel, which I feel like that in and of itself is its own series. But I'm also thinking of the very, very long-term globalist one world government plan going back to, like, you know, Khazaria, you know, and, you know, before Rockefeller became a Jew and all of that, and just thinking, okay, well, one of the perceived limitations in our understanding of third dimensional reality is a short lifespan, right? And this perceived limitation of time. So when I'm hearing you talk about time travel and Nazis and psychedelics, I'm seeing them passing the baton through, you know, these perceived incarnations to carry out their plan. And when you were talking about Bill Gates' obsession with Federer, and I was thinking of when I dug into my research about, okay, well, who was funding Albert Hoffman's research, and dropped into Gottlieb. And as I was reading about Gottlieb, from doing such deep research into Bill Gates for pandemic indoctrination last year, I thought, this is the same guy. Like, this is Bill Gates, and Gottlieb died and reincarnated as Gates to pick up that baton and to carry out the work. And how are psychedelics supporting this mission?
So I think there's a couple of things to what you just said. So first of all, yes, and this goes to what you talked about earlier with like the long game, like, right, that Hitler, so I can't remember if it was you or Robert said, Hitler was in too much of a rush, right? These other guys were like prepared for the 1,000-year plan, because I think that from their deep research into genetics, they understand that our DNA actually is a time travel device. It is a portal, right? And so like it is, whatever, you know, we have lots of questions because we see these people from history who seem to look just like people from today, right? You know, and there seems to be some things that are closely guarded in secret societies. I think the ability to create realities, but I think also intentional reincarnation, or the ability to sort of like that. I think there's some things going on, you know, with that, where like I do think that that is something that people are doing, where they have figured out how to drop their body, reincarnate into a new one, and not lose whatever their main.
I mean, isn't that part of the MK lore, this alleged soul bank underneath, you know, the Los Alamos laboratory here?
I mean, I think there's a number of ways to do it, right? I think there are people who have achieved the ability to do it naturally through their own natural affinity and ability to alchemize themselves. And then I think there's technological processes. And I think this is part of what I was talking about with like each sort of culture, society, or control group has a different method with which they do it. And they think theirs is the preferable way or the right way. And the bickering between them isn't really over the things we think it's over. It's over access to, preference, who does it the right way, who does it better. Like Tesla didn't like the way Edison did it, right? Like, you know, people who like the way Nadal plays don't like the way Federer plays as much, or Djokovic or whatever. Like, it comes down to the stylistic battle over the right way to enter into the domination space, or whatever. I mean, I don't even know if I'm saying that right, but that's what it is. That's what so many of these cultures have developed around, right?
Yep.
You know, and think about anything that you really like. Like when I go to a party that I really like, which I also think parties are portals and they're time travel devices of a sort and observation decks for viewing other realities. Like it is, you know, there's a particular kind of music that is my most favorite, even though I can appreciate the others. There's something I really like. And there's a look that I really like in terms of like the visuals of the place and the kind of people that are there and the sound system and the whole process of like, you know, like where the party is. And it, like all this stuff plays into it. And the same goes for this stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, you know, so that's what I think we're looking at. And so to answer the question about, you know, you were confused about the political stuff is just, that's there for the confusion. It's right. To keep the people busy while mom goes to the kitchen and cooks dinner. And in this case, cooking dinner is, you know, super high technology, time travel, you know, portaling to other worlds, like all sorts of stuff like that, right? Like telepathy, this, that, and the other thing. So it's for the children in the playroom with the toys to, you know, throw shit at each other, and that's all.
Let me suggest a book and a movie that you guys might enjoy, which sort of ironically was suggested to me by Alan Piper. We corresponded when he was writing these papers, and he taught me a lot of stuff. And he asked me if I'd ever seen or read a novella by Mircea Eliade. Mircea Eliade, you may or may not know, was one of the great scholars of the history of religion in the last century, Mircea. Most people think his name is pronounced Mircea, but it's Mircea Eliade, who was my professor, my mentor when I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago. And he founded the discipline of the history of religions. And he was a colleague and associate of Carl Jung's, and was a member himself of some of these kind of occult societies in Europe. He died in 1986. I was one of his last students. And one of the themes of Eliade's work was this notion of time and what he called the terror of history, and looking throughout the history of religion, ways that mystical societies have sought to deal with this problem, the terror of history, or overcoming time. Well, I didn't know until he wrote mostly scholarly books, and but also quite a number of novels and novellas, which have only started to be translated into English. He was Romanian, but he wrote in French. He knew 9 languages, and one of his last efforts was a little book called Youth Without Youth, which is a story about a guy who gets a 70-year-old professor who's very depressed that he hadn't discovered the origin of language, and he's on his way back to his hometown to commit suicide. And on the way, he gets hit by lightning. And the lightning doesn't kill him. He wakes up in the hospital all bandaged up. The lightning doesn't kill him, but what it actually does is regenerate him. And he goes from a 70-year-old suicidal man to a man in his 30s who fucks all the nurses in the hospital and stuff. And and then the Nazis find out about this magical thing that happened to him, and that's the novella Youth Without Youth. Now Francis Coppola made a movie about this novel. That's sort of a low-budget movie that Coppola made himself. It's like he's got it's a really, really interesting story that Alan had asked me, and I'm sort of curious if it's just an allegory about psychedelic drugs, because Eliade, like I said, was one of the foremost scholar, kind of a controversial figure, but really one of the most foremost and respected scholars of yoga and shamanism and alchemy and mythology and in general the whole history of religion. And he was my professor, but he was really kind of phobic, it seemed, about psychedelic drugs. And when I first approached him about my interest in it, he was like, whoa, I don't know about that stuff. And I said, well, I'm going to teach you about it, because there's a whole lot of misunderstanding. We would have all these dialogues about it. And anyway, it's just a whole fascinating thing. And I'd be really you would enjoy the movie in light of your thoughts here about time travel and overcoming time, and the focus that this may have been for the occult societies. Eliade, I later found out after he died about his affiliation with far right Nazi-like groups in Romania, and etc. It gets into the whole thing, but.
So, a couple of things. Thank you for the recommendation. I'll check that stuff out. I have a couple for you. First, in response to what you just said, is both allegory and true. I'm going to recommend a book by a gentleman named Jerry Tennant called Healing is Voltage, right?
Healing is Voltage? Wait a minute.
Is Voltage.
I'm just getting my my notebook. Where is it?
I love how old school he is. He has a real rug as a background, not like a virtual background. He's got his notebook.
I should have had this.
Cultural legitimacy to have the rug background.
Totally. So Healing is Voltage by Jerry Tennant.
Okay.
And Jerry Tennant, how I became aware of Jerry Tennant was through the Thunderbolts Project, which I also suggest you check out. You can go to their YouTube channel, and their stuff is all about the electric universe. And they have a variety of ways that they present their information, and it's really interesting.
Okay.
But I'm going to ask you about your 9/11 knowledge. Maybe I'm going to broaden some of that for you. Like, there's 3 books that I think that were the most important and helpful to me in understanding 9/11. And those books are Where Did the Towers Go by Judy Wood. And
I know her.
Okay, so you're familiar with that. There's another book by Joseph Farrell called Hidden Finance, Rogue Networks, and Secret Sorcery. The Fascist International, 9/11, and Penetrated Operations, right? And all of his work.
Go back. What's the book about the finance?
It's called Hidden Finance, Rogue Networks, and Secret Sorcery. The Fascist International, 9/11, and Penetrated Operations. That's the full title. It's by Joseph.
Best title I've ever heard.
Okay. It's the.
You don't even have to read the book. It's just you just get it off from the title. What's the author?
Joseph P. Farrell. He's written tons of books that you would appreciate because he is a scholar in patristics, I believe. So also I think he went to Oxford or Cambridge and studied, religion and stuff like that. But his work is largely focused on Nazism and high technology and occultism that goes along with it and stuff. There might be some answers. I have some issues with some of his stuff, but his work is very good. It's just focused on sort of one version of a reality, but I think his work is good and interesting. And then the other book that I would recommend is Coup de 12 by David Martin. So all 3 of the books I recommended are about 9/11. And I think when you
David Martin?
David E. Martin, Coup de 12.
The David Martin that you guys had on?
Yes. So that was how I was introduced to him many, many years ago when he was, doing interviews based on that book. And
okay.
And he also has been very connected with like the free energy and breakthrough energy kind of movements and stuff like that. But if you kind of put those 3 books together, right, I think that however your brain creates projective geometry from nodal points in those 3 books, you'll have an understanding of sort of the moving parts of the entire operation and what's really going on, and that it really isn't so much an issue of was it the Bush cabal or was it the Zionists or whatever, right? Like there's a higher thing going on.
Yeah. Well, let me just say this is another weird time thing, because I'll try to be brief. When I graduated from undergraduate college here in Santa Cruz, connections in my family my brother-in-law, my parents, and tried to lure me back to the East Coast by, it was arranged for me to have a job at Lehman Brothers, a big investment firm in New York. even though, you know, I've been doing all this other stuff in psychology and religion, and it's like, oh, you know, why don't you come back here and you can come work here and look, this is all the money you could make and all this. And so I thought, maybe. And so I was gonna go, I went back to New York, but on the way, I stopped at to see an old girlfriend of mine who was just finishing working on her PhD at Claremont under David Ray Griffin.
Uh-huh.
And she used to rave about David Ray Griffin, and she was studying process philosophy and philosophy of religion. And so I went down to Claremont to say goodbye to her, and she wanted to introduce me to David Griffin. And I said to him, he said, well, so what are you doing? I said, well, I'm really interested in mysticism and consciousness, but I think I'm going to go back to New York and work on Wall Street for a couple of years and make a bunch of money and then go become a scholar and a mystic. And he said, well, you know, beware of the golden handcuffs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, right now you might think that 500,000 is a lot of money, but you know, you're going to have house payments and a BMW, and you know, people get caught. So be careful, don't get caught. And I go, okay. So I go back to New York, and I go and I shave my beard and get a suit, and I start this thing that my brother-in-law has arranged for me to work at Lehman Brothers. And I go there, and the first day I thought, oh, I can't do this. Second day, I'm like, so by the third day, it's Friday, I come into work, I'm just shadowing people, and I don't shave. And my brother-in-law comes over to me and he says, you know, Bobby, you gotta look the part. You can't do this. And I said, Greg, this is my last day. And so I didn't do the Lehman Brothers thing, and I went to divinity school instead. That was like 1981. And then, okay, fast forward 20 years, it's 9/11, it's 2001. 9/11 happens. I go out to dinner with my brother-in-law, who is no longer with Lehman, but he's with another big company. And he lets me know, sort of accidentally, that it's an inside job, that his firm was advised by the government that it was going to happen, and they acted accordingly, and all the shorting of blah, blah, blah. And he was admitting to me that he was in on it. I still didn't really get it. I was just starting this relationship with Karen. I was going to get involved in the film world. People tell me, oh, it was an inside job, blah, blah, blah. I was like, come on, that's bullshit. You know, I don't want to hear that stuff. And it wasn't until 2003 that a friend of mine said 9/11 was an inside job. And I said, come on, that can't be true. And she said, yes, I know, but I just read this book by David Ray Griffin.
Mm-hmm.
I said, David Ray Griffin, what? He wrote a book about this? He's a theologian. He's like one of the most rigorous scholars and intellectuals in the world. He wrote a book about 9/11? And she goes to her shelf and she takes the book out and she puts it in my hand. And I was like, holy fuck. And then I read the book, and that was a life-changing thing. But I just thought it was so very interesting that, again, this thing that happened 20 years earlier with this guy, I mean, David Ray Griffin is like an impeccable scholar, one of the most rigorous, intellectuals in the world. And has written, of course, a dozen books on 9/11. And so.
So again, for the second time in this show, you've demonstrated my, right? So this is all of these characters that you knew across a variety of pursuits, right? Like it's quite interesting. Like most people don't necessarily have that many, crossovers with people both from, psychedelic space, religious space, intellectual, scientific, financial, but that's a thing they love because they went after you. They love applying these mystical psychedelic minds to the financial industry, right? And to technology and stuff like that, because all that stuff, like all those things are based on sort of the connections, the neural networks that you sort of activate with these mystical experiences. And you are a transmitter of that. So it doesn't surprise me that they would want to pick your brain for something, to do with that sort of awareness. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we all have things to sort of look into. I'm wondering about who we should do next. The names that sort of came up in this, the only ones that really came up in relation to Hoffman were Stan Groff and Timothy Leary. Do you have a preference as to who we dive into next, Robert? One of those two or someone different?
Well, I was Stan Groff was one of my first major gurus.
All right, let's do that then. Let's do that.
I don't really have all that much to say about Stan. I still just love him, and I really value his work. I know there's some people have looked into a critical approach to him and Esalen and things like that. But Tim, who I maintained a relationship with throughout a lot of his life, and it's a more exciting story. So I think we should jump right into Tim.
Because he's so foundational,
Tim?
I said Leary's so foundational, and you have such an intricate relatedness with him. Let's do Leary next.
All right, so let's do Leary.
So I would like to, can we say this now? Because I did a book on Tim. It was actually, I described that thing with Albert and the anti-Semitic thing. It was actually right after that. So that was in 1993 that I had that experience with Albert in Sandoz, because I'd gone to this conference in Switzerland. That's right. And then I came back and I was so kind of like, huh. And so I called Tim. And I went down, I'd known him for a while, and I went down and spent a weekend with Tim at his house. And up till that point, he was still sort of a nemesis to me. That's kind of the narrative of the psychedelic history, is that psychedelic drugs were going to be so great. And then Leary came around and blew it for everyone. That's the story that Michael Pollan puts out. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of bought that, and Tim was just sort of a fool and reckless and ruined this body of research and, turned it political, and what a mess he made of everything. And I was accepting of that. But then I realized this little thing, and I went down to spend a weekend with him, and it was just really him and I in his house, and for a couple of days, and I really connected with him, and I realized, oh my God, there's a whole nother story here. And that's what motivated me to quit my position as a director of the Albert Hoffman Foundation and decided to do this book on Tim, a memorial volume to kind of give another point of view of his madness, that there was a method to his madness. And so I worked on that for a few years and published this book called Outside Looking In about Timothy Leary. I might even have a copy, just saying.
I love how he has everything within reach of, and that he knows where it is.
No, I don't know where. Oh yeah,
that's what happens when your house burns down and you only have a few possessions left.
So look, this is a kind of cool book. That is called Outside Looking In. That is a memorial volume for Timothy Leary that I had a lot of fun doing. And it's really overlooked. There have been several books.
All right, I'm going to read it. I'm going to order it and I'm going to read it.
Okay.
I'm going to read it. All right, let's wrap it up here. Anything you'd like to say before we go, Dani?
It was so lovely to drop in with you, beautiful humans.
Thank you. Likewise. And wishing you a very happy birthday, and that your
Is it your birthday today?
Tomorrow.
Oh, happy birthday. All right. Okay, so we'll be back next month with 36.3, which will be Timothy Leary. Robert, thank you again for joining us. And you guys can talk to Robert. He's very interactive with people who follow him on Facebook. So you guys can find him there if you'd like to chat with him, and he'll be back here with us next month. Till then.
Yeah. And Emily, wait, I mean this. I want you to ground some of these brilliant ideas you have in something that's old-fashioned, like one of these things. so we can flip through it and go, wait a second, hold on, and look at a reference and expand it, because a lot of stuff, and I feel this way about our conversations too, that we need to produce stuff, and stuff gets lost in the ethers, and it's harder to censor when you actually have three-dimensional products. So let's think about that.
All right. Well, if you know a writer, you can let me know.
Yeah, I don't know any writers.
You can give me their phone number. right, guys, we'll see you guys next time. Take care.